Chapter 10. In the Image of God. I have now outlined the leading facts of organic evolution which conspire to prove beyond a doubt the existence of an infinite intelligence, a divine mind, which is the origin and the great first cause of life and mind on this planet. By the aid of those great scientists to whom the world is indebted for the facts and arguments which demonstrate the essential truth of the theory of organic evolution, I have been able to trace the descent of man back to a divine ancestry. I might pause here, for it is sufficiently evident, from what has already been said, not only that a divine intelligence exists, but that an intimate personal relationship exists between that divine intelligence and mankind. It is, in fact, sufficiently evident that God is our Father, and that it was therefore a calm statement of a literal truth, and not an oriental extravagance or a figure of speech, that Jesus employed when he proclaimed the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. The inerrant intuitions of the man of Nazareth are thus made manifest by the inductions of modern science. And thus the great fundamental principle of the Christian religion is shown to rest upon a firm scientific foundation as well as upon the authority of a divine intuition or revelation. It is shown that there are not two antagonistic orders of truth in the universe, one scientific and the other religious, but that, on the contrary, religious truth will not and cannot be antagonized by true science. It is only by a false and vicious interpretation of the facts of nature that religious truth is antagonized. True science is, therefore, the handmaid of true religion, and the reconciliation of religion and science only awaits a true interpretation of the phenomena of nature. There is, however, another sublime intuition that remains to be considered. It was by an older prophet than Jesus, but it is of equal interest and importance with that which we have been considering. It is, indeed, a corollary of the fact of divine fatherhood, and, under the law of heredity, it must be equally true and verifiable. I refer to the declaration of the prophet of old that man was made in the image of God. I am quite well aware of the anthropomorphic interpretation of that declaration that has been given to it by the enemies of the Christian religion. I am also aware that atheism has been wont to contribute to the gaiety of its cult by picturing to the imagination a man of colossal proportions, a physical and intellectual monster, as the true interpretation of the prophet's conception of God. Of course, as all but atheists are aware, the words were spoken, not of physical man, but of mental attributes. But even this higher conception did not entirely remove it from the charge of gross anthropomorphism, so long as the crude ideas of the old psychology were imported into it and made a part of the conception. The old psychology bore it in upon us, with perpetual insistence, that the highest intellectual power with which man is invested is that of inductive reasoning. The conception of God was, therefore, necessarily limited by the prevailing ideas of the powers of man. The highest possible conception of God, therefore, under the old psychological ideas, was that of a being endowed with infinite reasoning powers. Inductive reasoning, as I have often remarked, is merely a method of inquiry, and a very slow and laborious method it is. It is a systematic effort to find out something of which we are ignorant. Extending that faculty to infinity does not change its character nor divest it of its limitations. A God of infinite reason, therefore, would still be a searcher after facts and a guesser at conclusions. It is obvious that a conception of deity based upon man's inductive powers is of a being of limited intelligence, and hence open to the charge of anthropomorphism. I repeat, therefore, what I have so strongly insisted upon in the earlier chapter of this book, that the brain is a physical organ, a product of organic evolution, especially adapted to a physical environment and to no other, and that its powers of induction are no more a part of man's divine heritage than are his powers of deglutition. The divine part of man is his subjective mind, the mind of his immortal soul, which exists independently of the body or any of its physical organs, which is literally a spark of the divine intelligence, literally a part of the mind of God. It is to this part of man that I now wish to invite the attention of my readers, asking them to bear in mind the declaration of the prophet that man was made in the image of God, and of Jesus, that we are the sons of God. I do so for a twofold purpose, namely, first, to emphasize what has already been proven by the facts of organic evolution relating to the divine origin of life, and secondly, to draw the legitimate deductions as to the character, attributes, and powers of God. That is to say, having abundantly proved from the facts of organic evolution that man is the offspring of God. It is now logically legitimate to analyze the faculties of the offspring for the purpose of ascertaining something of the attributes and powers of the ancestor. Under the law of heredity, this is not only a legitimate logical process, but it is one that ensures approximately correct results. Not that it is given to finite minds to comprehend the infinite intelligence or to fathom its mysteries, but that he is not utterly unknowable by his children. Before proceeding to an analysis of the faculties of the subjective mind, I wish to say a word in regard to its so-called limitations resulting from the law of suggestion. I have heretofore pointed out the fact that the law of suggestion is a necessary limitation of the independence of the soul during its sojourn in a physical environment, for the reason that, during the transitional period from savagery to civilization, the emotions require the regulating influence of reason. That influence, of course, could only be acquired and maintained by the reasoning mind by virtue of such a limitation of power as the law of suggestion imposes upon the subjective mind. This limitation continues, as I have shown, until conscience becomes an instinctive emotion of the soul, after which the subjective mind assumes a normal ascendancy. I have drawn the conclusion, from all the facts in the case, that the subjective mind was created with a special adaptation to a higher life, an environment of truth, where no false suggestions can reach it. I have also shown that the so-called law of suggestion is but another way of stating the fact that the subjective mind is not endowed with the power or faculty of inductive reasoning, and that apparent limitation is due to the fact that, in the higher life to which it is destined, the faculty of intuition is the dominant intellectual faculty. The latter faculty enables its possessor to acquire a knowledge of the laws of its being and its environmental conditions by immediate, intuitive perception, and this, of course, would render the inductive faculty useless and superfluous, in fact, impossible. I repeat these observations here merely for the purpose of inviting renewed attention to the fact that an omniscient intelligence is necessarily independent of the use of inductive reasoning, the latter being merely a method of inquiry. By a limited, finite intelligence, it will thus be seen that the very limitations of the powers of the subjective mind proclaim its divine origin and give promise of its ultimate destiny. They constitute, in fact, indubitable evidence that, in the highest sense of the expression, man was made in the image of God. Now, let us examine systematically the faculties of the subjective mind of man, with a view to finding what further evidence they afford of his divine origin and likeness, but more especially with a view to finding what conceptions of the attributes and powers of God may arise from a knowledge of those of his children. To facilitate such an examination, I append below a table exhibiting in systematic order all of the purely subjective faculties. The right-hand column shows the faculties as they actually exist in man. The left-hand column shows what they would be by infinite extension without a change in their essential characteristics. In other words, the right-hand column exhibits man's subjective faculties as they exist, and the left-hand column shows the conception of deity which is necessarily derivable from a knowledge of their existence in their divine origin, God, omniscience. Man, instinct or intuition, deductive powers, potentially perfect, memory, potentially perfect. God, omnipotence. Man, telekinetic energy. God, omnipresence. Man, telepathy. Infinite love, natural emotions. A few words will further explain and justify this table and its implications. At the head of the list, as beseems its godlike potency, is intuition, the potentialities of which can be adequately described only by the employment of terms that express the highest attribute of omniscience. The power of apprehending essential truth antecedent to and independent of reason, experience, or instruction. It was by the exercise of this faculty that the prophet of old was enabled to grasp that most fundamental of all psychological truths, that man was made in the image of God. Men have called it inspiration, and certain it is that it is the basis of all that we know of inspiration. It is the instantaneous perception of fundamental and necessary truth. Its first manifestation on earth was in the monoran, and science named it instinct. In all the lower animals it is thus designated. In man it is named intuition. By infinite extension it becomes omniscience. It is the one faculty possessed by the human soul that proclaims the divine pedigree of man in terms that cannot be misunderstood. Without it, animal life would have perished on the threshold of the organic world. Abolish it from the universe, and the animal world would perish in a generation, and God would cease to be omniscient. It is the intelligence behind creative energy, and it is the preserver of sentient life everywhere. The next faculty on the list is that of deductive reasoning. It is the inseparable concomitant of intuition. The latter grasps the law by instantaneous perception, and the former, with the same inconceivable rapidity of mentation, deduces all legitimate conclusions and consequences, near and remote. Indeed, the processes of mentation in the subjective mind are so inconceivably rapid that it is impossible, in cases of genuine intuition, to know where the work of intuition ends and the process of deduction begins. Again, we are reminded of the attributes of omniscience, and we are enabled to form a finite conception of the means by which God knows the past, present, and future. He knows the past by means of a memory that is absolute, the present by immediate cognition, and the future by means of an infinite knowledge of laws and causes, proximate and ultimate, and infinite powers of inerrant deduction. The next on the list is the potentially perfect memory of the subjective mind. Little need be said on this subject beyond the fact that it is an inherent faculty in the subjective mind of man, and that it is necessarily an attribute of omniscience. Here, then, we have the three intellectual faculties of the subjective mind of man, namely, intuition, deduction, and memory, all potentially perfect. That is to say, these faculties exist in the subjective mind of man, and are often phenomenally manifested in such a way as to reveal their wonderful potentialities, as in men of genius, in mathematical and musical prodigies, and in feats of memory far beyond the capability of the objective mind. Thus, the intuitive perception of the laws of quantity or of numbers is shown in such prodigies as Zerah Colburn, Jedediah Buckstone, and others, and deduction enables them to give, instantaneously, the exact answer in figures to the most intricate mathematical problems. Perfect memory is revealed in such prodigious feats as that related by Coleridge of the ignorant servant girl who repeated whole pages of Latin and Greek many years after having heard her master read those passages aloud in a room adjoining the one in which she was engaged in household work. She could not even read her own language, and her objective mind took no note of what she heard, and yet every word was indelibly impressed upon the mind of the soul, only to reappear, years after, when the functions of the brain were inhibited by disease and imminent dissolution. Thus is revealed, often under pathological conditions, it is true, the latent intellectual capacities of the subjective mind, the mind energy of the human soul. It goes without saying that what is thus revealed in one mind must exist potentially in all other human minds, and that they only await proper conditions for their manifestation. The essential condition being the inhibition of the functions of the objective mind, it follows that the most perfect conditions under which those powers can reach their full fruition must be the complete removal of the clogs of our earthly investiture. This, however, is a digression. Returning to the subject under immediate consideration, it must be evident that the subjective mind of man is endowed with a complete intellectual equipment with divine potentialities, and that the faculties thus shown to exist in each one of us are embryonic omniscience. That is to say, the same faculties, simply by infinite enlargement and extension of their capacity, without changing their essential nature, would become omniscience. The next faculty or power of the human soul to be considered is what I have designated as telekinetic energy. It is simply the power to move ponderable bodies without physical contact or mechanical appliances. I am aware that I shall run counter to the prejudices of some and transcend the sphere of observation of many when I say that this is the power exercised by so-called spirit mediums when they cause tables or other ponderable bodies to be levitated. I can only say to the skeptical that I know the power to exist, having for more than 30 years of my life pursued the investigation of so-called spiritistic phenomena, under the strictest test conditions, with two clearly defined objects in view. Namely, first, to ascertain whether the alleged physical phenomena were really produced by supernormal means, and, secondly, for the purpose of trying to find the underlying principle which would correlate all psychic phenomena. Whether I have been successful in the latter quest, the readers of my published works must judge for themselves. But as to the first, I can only assure my readers that I have applied every possible scientific test to nearly every form of physical phenomena, especially to that of the levitation of ponderable bodies without physical contact or mechanical aids. And that is the result of my researches. I am prepared to asseverate that the power exists in the subjective mind of man to cause inanimate matter to obey his will rather than the law of gravitation. The only wonder to my mind is that anyone who cares to know the truth should deny the fact, since it is so easily ascertained to be true by anyone who will consent to conduct a candid, unprejudiced investigation. The attitude of denial of the physical phenomena of spiritism is especially inexplicable, since not one of them possesses, in itself, any evidential value whatever for or against the doctrine that spirits of the dead communicate with the living. This is a logical truism that the world has been very slow to learn. Believers in the verity of the New Testament records certainly have no right or occasion to doubt the existence of the power of levitation, since Jesus walked upon the water. If it is replied that he was exceptionally endowed, it must not be forgotten that Peter did the same thing. And the words of reproof addressed by the Master to Peter when he began to sink clearly indicated the source of the power. O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? I submit that a volume of scientific dissertation could not have more clearly stated the fact that the power arose from the mental attitude of the individual and not from any extraneous source, human or divine. I have been thus insistent upon the recognition of this power in man, for the reason that, while it possesses no evidential value whatever in favor of the spiritistic hypothesis, it does constitute an important link in the chain of evidence going to prove the divine origin of man and his likeness to his omnipotent Father. A word will make my meaning clear. This power, whether it emanates from spirits of the dead or spirits of the living, is clearly a spiritual or mental force or energy. It is an energy that moves and controls matter independently of physical organism, for it endows inert ponderable substances with apparent intelligence. That is to say, it not only causes ponderable bodies to move, but to answer questions intelligently by prescribed movements. It emanates, therefore, from some intelligence and is controlled by volition. That intelligence is the subjective mind of man. Embodied or disembodied, it is the mind of a human soul. It is obvious that this power or energy corresponds to that infinite spiritual energy that assembled matter and created the material universe. In other words, that spiritual power, resident in the subjective mind of man, which is known to science as telekinetic energy, enlarged and extended to infinity, without changing its essential nature, becomes omnipotence. The next faculty on the list is that of telepathy, the power possessed by the subjective minds of men to communicate intelligence from one to another independently of the ordinary sensory channels of transmission. Science has demonstrated the existence of this faculty in certain exceptionally developed persons known to scientists as psychics. A psychic is a person who has developed the power to elevate the operations of his subjective mind above the threshold of normal consciousness. They are called by as many different names as there are theories of causation, clairvoyance, and spirit mediums being among the most common designations. It is often developed spontaneously, without any known cause, and hypnotism is a powerful agency through which it may be experimentally demonstrated to exist. It was largely by this agency that the Society for Psychical Research conducted its investigations, although spontaneous cases are much in evidence in their reports. So-called mediumship is, however, the most prolific source of telepathic phenomena, although it is not recognized as such by the mediums themselves. A good medium is, nevertheless, simply a good telepathist, and it is to this power, exercised unconsciously and dominated by the law of suggestion, that is due all that is mysterious in the so-called communications from the other world. At least no alleged communication has ever yet been brought to light that cannot be thus accounted for. The same is true of all other methods of divination where the past, present, or future of an individual is accurately stated, without previous knowledge. It will thus be seen that telepathy is a very important faculty of the human mind, for it explains more of that which is uncanny and mysterious in psychic phenomena than all other things combined. This, however, is the limit of its practical usefulness in this life, for the reason that, owing to the constantly modifying influence of the law of suggestion, it can never be relied upon as a practical means of communication. It is in its implications that its importance is transcendent. The most important may be enumerated as follows. First, it gives us the logical right to believe that, since it performs no normal function in this life, it must be destined to a normal use in the future life. This implication is reinforced by the fact A. That it is exactly adapted to the uses of disembodied souls. B. That it is not adapted to incarnate souls, being only manifested under abnormal conditions. And C. That a mental faculty without a normal function to perform somewhere is inconceivable. Secondly, the fact that this or any other faculty is possessed by any one or more persons is demonstrative that all other persons possess the same faculty to a greater or less degree. It is at least latent in every human being. For a full discussion of this subject, see a scientific demonstration of the future life. Thirdly, it follows that it existed potentially in all the ancestry of man, near and remote. We must therefore conclude that, since man traces his ancestry back to the divine mind, and since man was made in the image of God, the faculty which we are considering must exist, potentially at least, in the divine mind. The stupendous consequences which this conclusion involves cannot be adequately considered in this connection. It is obvious, however, that here is the means by which man may reach the mind of God through prayer. Here is the means by which God may reach the souls of men who choose to open the line of communication by placing themselves in the proper mental attitude. Here is the agency of divine inspiration. Does God answer the prayers of his children? Does God inspire men with a knowledge of his laws and a desire to do his will? These are great questions, which, for the present, each one must answer for himself, guided by the light of his own experience. It is outside the province of this volume to discuss them. I am simply trying to conduct an inductive inquiry with a view of ascertaining something of the general laws pertaining to the relationship which man sustains to his Maker. In this immediate connection, I have shown that a law exists through which the divine consciousness may be reached, and it follows that the converse may also be true. In other words, potentially man is able to commune with God, and God with man, without violating or transcending natural law. In the meantime, there is another fact connected with the faculty of telepathy which is of more immediate importance than any we have considered, for in a sense it includes all the others. I refer to the fact that distance interposes no obstacle to the exercise of telepathic power. That is to say, it is apparently just as easy to communicate telepathically with a friend at the Antipodes as with one in an adjoining room. The records of the London Society for Psychical Research show that some of the most remarkable cases of telepathic communion have been between persons thus widely separated. For the purposes of telepathic communion, therefore, space does not enter as an adverse factor. To all intents and purposes, the agent is present with the percipient, and vice versa. It is obvious that when this faculty or power or energy is enlarged and extended to infinity, it becomes the divine attribute of omnipresence. We now approach in the question that is of more vital importance to mankind than anything else pertaining to the relationship existent between God and his children. Thus far we have seen that the faculties of the subjective mind of man, enlarged to infinity, give us a conception of an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent deity. But those attributes alone do not satisfy the cravings of the human heart, nor are they commensurate with the unperverted intuitions of the human soul. Neither is a deity who has only those attributes the God of Christian faith, for that faith is founded upon the inerrant intuitions of the man of Nazareth, and he proclaimed a God of infinite love, mercy, and benevolence. If therefore his perceptions of divine truth were inerrant, and if the prophet of old failed not in his apprehension of ultimate verity when he declared that man was made in the image of God, we may confidently expect to find the soul of man to be correspondingly endowed. Accordingly, we find that the natural emotions are located in the subjective mind. Little further need be said on this branch of the subject beyond reminding the reader of what I pointed out in the earlier chapters of this book. It will be recalled that I showed that the so-called animal passions, in their ultimate development, regulation, and purification, are all essentially altruistic.